Sandoval,
And I'm Lamont Williams.
and we are playing Dread. This week, Harvester. Definitely probably the least known game that we've covered so far, although it is one that is starting to, if not hasn't already picked up a little bit of notoriety in recent memory. Certainly was not one that I was as aware of as I am a lot of the other games that we typically talk about on this podcast. Lamont, I usually like to start our discussion by asking you, like, what your memory of this thing was, if you have a memory, or if you knew anything about this at all coming into us doing research on it. But I think I already know the answer to that question.
Oh yeah, Adrian, I'm going to tell you right now that that is a hard no. Like until we started talking about this game, I have never heard of it. And like in some ways I feel like maybe I am better for not having heard of it.
I did say at the end of the last episode that this is a game that like no one should actually play, even though I do think it's a fascinating game, and one that I'm really excited to actually talk about with you. But like, yeah, that being said, this is, and I think that we're gonna in this podcast go over a lot of where we were around the time that this game came out, and we're gonna talk a lot about the culture surrounding the game. In a lot of ways, we're gonna talk more about stuff around the game than we are gonna the game itself. So there is definitely gonna be some stuff about our past coming up, but, you know, I am someone who knew a lot about video games. I mean, I've, like, lived and breathed video games as long as I've been alive, basically. Like, I read every gaming magazine that I could get my hands on. I was the first section I would go to in the store whenever me and my parents would, go out to, like, toy stores and things. I would look at every box. I saw every box. I wasn't rich or anything, so I couldn't play every video game, but, like, even if I didn't play a game, I certainly knew about it either from, like, magazines or friends' houses and things like that, and I kept my finger on the pulse of, like, the game industry as best that, like, a 10 to 13-year-old could at the time, and we're gonna talk a little bit about that today. But all of that said, I'm sure I heard about Harvester at some point. I'm sure it came up in some magazine I read. I'm sure I probably saw the box. And honestly, thinking about it, I do feel like I remember seeing like screenshots of it before, but I didn't really know anything about the game. I didn't really think of it that much. It really wasn't until I guess a couple of years ago that a YouTube show that probably a lot of listeners are familiar with, Game Grumps, started playing the game. And I'm not even a really big Game Grumps fan. I mean, I've been following Aaron Hansen, Ego Raptor since the Newground Metal Gear Awesome days. But it's a show that I only like very, very, very occasionally watch. Usually, if it's like a game I already know or have like some kind of interest in. I don't know what it was about Harvester. Probably just that it was a, weird 90s point and click I don't know anything about that made me watch that episode. And I I felt like more bewildered than anything. Like it's definitely a game that you take like you look at for like not even like 10 minutes into the game, and it's kind of like a what am I watching kind of thing. Not even what am I playing, like more of a what am I watching.
I see that and I completely agree with that.
Yeah, so and then just even watching it, I guess, got me fascinated enough that I started like, well, number one, I bought it because you can get it on Good Old Games or Steam for as low as like $2 when there's a sale. I definitely paid like $2 for the game. I played all the way through it. I kind of understood what it was trying to do. And then I got an even better sense of what it was trying to do when I actually did like research on it and everything. I was like, oh, this game actually has a really fascinating history. I'd love to talk about this with someone. And I'm pretty sure I ranted your ear about it, like, before we decided to do this podcast. So, you know, honestly, this is one of the games that, like, I was most excited to start talking about. And to put this out there, I know I'm not alone in this. I think we've referenced this in the podcast before, but if it is your first time listening, first of all, hi. Second of all, I am one of my things I do is teach. I teach video game design. I teach video game history, and I remember in one of my history classes just overhearing a conversation between two of the students talking about Harvester. Like these are like 21, 22-year olds who are being made aware of this game because it's been doing its rounds on the internet with shows like Game Grumps. So now that it's, kind of gotten this sorta second life, people are starting to become aware of it, and it's starting to become, a cult classic, which part of that makes me happy. Another part of me goes, "Why?" Be like, you kind of already alluded to this, like, you kind of feel like you might have been better off not knowing the game existed.
I mean, it did some stuff. It made some choices, and some of them I get, and others I question. But I mean, here's my thoughts. And this game reminds me of, I don't know, maybe like 8th grade into ninth grade Lamont that really wanted to be like extra edgy and like was really into like the weirder parts of the internet. It just feels like this would have appealed to a Lamont that like really enjoyed going to the mall a lot.
Yeah, the definitely like the Jersey mall rat scene of the very late 90s, edges of the 2000s. No, I absolutely get that. Like what gosh, now I have to try and remember the names of some of those like awful websites. Like what was the name of that site that you were like could supposedly buy human meat from that era?
Oh, I can't remember. I know what you're talking about. I cannot
Yeah.
remember what it's called.
Yeah, and then like Harvester is the video game equivalent of that. For sure. Although this is a game from 1996, I'm pretty sure the period you're talking about is, like you said, 8th, ninth grade Le Mans. I'm gonna say that was like what, 99, 2000.
Yep, you got it.
Yeah, it's so funny because like in a lot of ways, a game that really does kind of feel like the culmination of 90s edge is also bleeding on that sort of 2001, 2002 post 90s, which I do consider like two separate eras. I do consider like 90s edge to be a little bit safer and a little bit more, there's still like an era of like cynicism there, but there is a little bit more of a sincerity and also a little bit more of a darkness to like the year like when we start to get into the 2000s and some of the not great websites that, we're referring to now, like those like darker corners of the internet before there was a thing called the dark web that just kind of existed because the internet was kind of like a new breeding ground that was a lot more open than our current one, right? Yeah, I do consider like that like 90s period and the early 2000s edginess, as it were, to be these two separate things. And Harvester absolutely is sitting on the borderline. And there are reasons for that, and it is very, very much intentional. So I think before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we should probably explain to the best of our ability like what this game actually is. And then we can, like, kinda use some of these things that we're kinda, like, talking around to kinda give a little bit more context to it.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good idea.
Alright, so, as I kinda said before, Harvester is a point and click adventure game from 1996. We are well into the CD era, and Harvester is also kinda interesting because it's a, Sillywood game. We already talked about Sillywood last podcast, so we don't need to get into that again, but, it's a game that has live action actors turned into 2D sprites pasted on top of I was gonna say bad CG backgrounds, but, like, there are a couple in Harvester that aren't bad, like, some of them are pretty good, and some of them are pretty terrible even for the era. There's a lot of, like, mixed bag of quality happening in this game in terms of the art and graphic department. But the important thing really, just no point and click adventure game. Everything's live action. The whole game is completely voice acted. But our main character, Steve, just only knows his name and is otherwise a complete amnesiac. Wakes up in what seems to be like a 1950s suburb. And I was going to use the term idyllic, but like, the game doesn't take very long before it kind of like jumps into its more twisted elements. So idyllic, I don't even think is like fitting even at the beginning of the game. Like the first thing that you see is your someone who says that they're your little brother anyway, this like 10-year-old kid in a cowboy costume watching television. That's basically the only pose they will have for the entire game is just they're glued to the TV. And I think like even in that first conversation, you actually do get to see like a little clip of what they're watching, and it is Native Americans being brutally, violently murdered by cowboys in black and white, but still like very graphic, very gory, in live action footage. So yeah, the game doesn't take any time like getting into its more uh extreme aspects, if I will. Oh, I guess I should have said at the top of this actually too, before I go any further, if you couldn't tell from that lovely description, all the content warnings that we can possibly apply can be applied to this episode. So, we're going to be talking about racism, homophobia, uh, suicide, sexual abuse, um,
Cannibalism.
cannibalism, animal harm. Like, if you can think of it, it is probably in Harvester, and it is more than likely going to come up today. So, if any of that bothers you, you know, feel free to skip this episode.
I do agree with Adrian on this one. Uh, if you do stay, we appreciate it, but also we completely understand if the topics that we're going to be talking about in this episode don't sit well with you.
Yeah, for sure. And, I don't wanna, like, go too deep into a lot of the weird tangents and weird content that is in this game, like, we'll bring up little things here and there as they are relevant, but the general idea is that the game is kind of split into 2 acts. The first act is Steve has to become part of what's called the Lodge. And already, like, the game is showing its 90s-ness. Like, the Lodge is, like, one part the secret society from Twin Peaks, a 90s show that this game is very clearly riffing on to a certain degree, but also, like, an obvious reference to things like the Elks Lodge or the Moose Lodge or one of those organizations. So Lamont, my mom was a member of the Elks Lodge, as was my grandmom. I don't know if you knew anybody who was in like one of those organizations or anything.
So my pop-up was a member of the Masonic Lodge,
Okay.
and it took me a long time to realize what that was or what that meant. But I remember going to the building a lot, and I remember all the portraits, and there were a lot of books. And truly, it wasn't until he passed and I saw his ring that it all made sense.
Right. Yeah. And, specifically, you mentioned the Masonic Lodge, which is definitely what the lodge in Harvester feels like it's mostly like being applied to, which tends to be the center of a lot of weird conspiracy theories that are, mostly just bunk, but there is sort of like feeling of mystique there that like Harvester is kind of like poking at with this. And I'll say right at the top of this, I do not have the deepest like connection to the history of a lot of these different organizations, Masonic or otherwise, like again, like the Elks and Moose Lodge, for example, which are mostly, from what I can tell, like basic community service such. But I do know that a lot of their members tend to be conservative. They tend to be religious to some degree, whether or not the organization itself is religious in nature, but it does tend to like get a lot of people from like kind of like those like small time communities such that are things that come up a lot in Harvester and probably are going to be stuff that we're going to be talking about through this episode. So you kind of get like why it's there and like why that's like the mission at the top of the game. For Steve, it is mostly a matter of I want to figure out what's going on in this weird town with these very weird people who seem to be doing very not normal things. But also there is the second element of the character of Stephanie, who Steve at the beginning is said to be engaged with, but she is locked away essentially at her parents' house because she has been grounded for life. And when you essentially, well, or grounded until the wedding at least, and when you go to talk to her, Stephanie makes it clear that she also has no memory of her life before, that she just kind of woke up in Harvest and was told that she was getting married and she was, had to be stay in this room until the wedding was over.
And that those weird people are her parents.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of that like kind of like damsel in distress that you see in every video game ever, at least in this time period. Throughout the game, you are given the typical point and click adventure tasks, which seem to be kind of like harmless pranks at first. And so the basic game loop is that okay, I'm starting a new day, I go to the lodge gives me a task, I go and perform that task, which again is usually like some kind of prank. So like the first thing that you have to do is key someone's car. The second thing that you have to do is you have to steal something from the firehouse, which we'll get to the firehouse in a little bit.
Oh, yeah, the
Um,
firehouse.
yeah. And the result by the end of the day is that your actions seem to have a kind of monkey's paw effect, and then someone gets radically hurt by it. Now, that description of this first act, might have you thinking that, like, well, okay, none of that sounds like super terrible. That's why I said, like, it's hard to talk about this game without, like, getting into those nitty-gritty details, which again, if we got into all of them, we'd be here all day. So, um, like, a good example, I guess, really is the fireman. So let's start there. So, pretty early on in the game, one of your first tasks involves getting a porn magazine, which in and of itself is kind of a strange task because again, it's supposed to be the 1950s. Not to say that porn didn't exist in the 1950s, but it wasn't something that like you're just going to go to the corner store, right? And just get from someone. But the lady at the counter there has a line that just kind of says something like, no, it's fine. I completely understand. This is the kind of thing that keeps a young man from becoming a fireman. Which, if you haven't visited the firehouse at this point, and you might not have because this is a pretty early quest in the game, might come off as kind of like strange or random. I do remember in that Game Grumps episode, which I'll link to in the show notes, they picked up on the implication right away, which is like, is she saying that like that if you become gay, you also become a fireman? Is that a stereotype? And sure enough, when you do actually visit the firehouse in town, all of the firemen speak in what I can only describe as like 90s gay man stereotype.
Ah, the lisp.
Yeah, I don't know if that lists stereotype, like if there's any like youngs or Gen Z people watching this, if they would even have an awareness that that was a thing. But definitely in the 90s, that was the stereotype, right? Like a heavy feminish, a feminish voice that has like sort of a lispiness to it. Every fireman, different actors for all of them, but they all have that kinda, like, 90s gay stereotype voice. They are all, like, clearly into each other, and also, like, they do fight fires, you do see them fight a fire at once, but, like, when they're not fighting fires, they're spending their time painting a not quite nude male model who sits in the middle of their fire department. It's all very odd, and also, I know, like, a lot of people who've played the game are also kind of like, "But also, what kind of stereotype is that?" Like, all that, like, all firemen are gay? That's very strange.
Yeah, it definitely is, very random, but I think that's the other thing is that, like, reading a little bit of the interview that you sent me, that was I think the point was that it was just supposed to be kind of random.
Yeah, I mean, there is a little bit of randomness to it. I mean, there's also, like Another podcast that we're probably going to be referencing a lot, the Savior Game podcast by YouTuber Pushing Up Roses and Matt Aukamp. Apologies, Matt, if I've mispronounced your name. They bring up the obvious fact of like, gay, flaming, firehouse, as part of the joke. I'm also guessing that part of the joke is that there is this sort of like again, this is a very 90s stereotype that I don't know if it reads as well today, but this idea of like men who do manual labor are probably gay was a stereotype at the time. So like the first thing I always think of is the Simpsons episode with the steel workers.
Oh,
Bart
man. I
Bart like,
forgot
"Dad,
about
why did you
that.
bring me to a gay steel mill?"
Oh, man.
But also like the village people.
That was my second thought was the Village People.
So it doesn't come from nowhere. It's not a complete like left turn, but to your point, Lamont, like yes, there is a lot of stuff in this game that is just bizarre for the sake of bizarre. Again, Twin Peaks is a big point of reference for this. There is a wasp lady, for example, who a woman who's very obsessed with wasps that never ends up tying into the game. Like, from my understanding, her part of the game was cut, but she never really played a big role in the story anyway. It's a clear allusion to the log lady from Twin Peaks, and so these kind of bizarre, but also very taboo characters and topics appear all over the game. I mean, again, the fact that there are gay characters who are explicitly told to you are gay in a game from 1996 is, you know, not something you saw every day. Like I'm not going to say it never happened before. That would be completely untrue, but it wasn't, it was clearly and somewhat unfortunate, to say this, but it was definitely like part of the decision there was part of the fact that they're trying to push buttons with this game. If it's not clear at this point, a lot of this game is about like pushing buttons and talking about taboo topics that you normally wouldn't see touched in a video game. And again, it's kind of unfortunate, but the gay firemen were a part of that. We already mentioned the television show that the kid is watching like Native Americans get brutally murdered, and you actually do go to that television station, and the lead actor, who is also like the director for the show, launches into what can only be called a very racist rant that is also kind of tinged with a lot of Cold War anti-communist sentiments of the 1950s that the game is alluding to, right? So, this game is like not shying away from very taboo topics. It's kind of dealing with them with the roughest knife possible. And like that's not even getting into things that are just completely gross, like the meat packing plant that is specifically killing and packaging cats. Like it is a game that is very much meant to just kind of like I was gonna say offend. I think it goes a little bit deeper than that, but like right now we're just kind of talking about like the brief overview of the game. And definitely if you have no context for anything just jumping into this, like I think like anyone's first thought looking at all of this just on its face, like things that are there within like, 10, 20 minutes of booting the game up are going to say, yeah, this is a game that's like mostly just trying to be as offensive as possible.
And honestly, the fact that it is shock that is not necessarily completely for the sake of shock is surprising.
Yeah, and that's definitely something I want to dive into a little bit more. But to kind of like wrap up talking about the act one portion of the game. So you do these different tasks and then people get hurt. So for one example, you steal the fabric from the fire department, which then causes all of the firemen to distrust each other and then they end up murdering each other. Or at least beating each other to a bloody pulp, which in and of itself is an offensive stereotype, but, like, just to kinda get you the idea, right? The next thing you do is you have to steal a barber pole from the local barber, and that causes the barber to kinda carelessly trip into a puddle of water, and then, like, there are exposed wires from the barber pole and thus, like, electrocuting and murdering the barber. You have to burn down the local diner and then, completely distraught, the owner, waitress of the diner, not only commits suicide, but also murders her 8-year-old daughter,
Oh, yeah.
who you actually see the daughter, like, hanging by a noose in the game. So that's the first act of the game. And one thing that I wanna point out is that if you kinda like if you're following the track and you're listening to the dialogue throughout the game, what you're kinda like start to notice is that everybody that gets hurt, like the first guy when you scratch the car, like that guy's just an asshole, right? And so like the fact that he kind of he doesn't like get any like bodily harm done to him, but he does kind of like recede into himself and just kind of like, like mental damage more than anything else, right? That's kind of like a whatever thing. Everybody else who gets like seriously maimed or killed because of the main player's actions first are gay men. The second is an immigrant, the like one of the immigrants in the game that certain choice members of the main cast have opinions about. And the third is a woman. You might be noticing a trend among the people who get the most affected by your actions here. And that might be a hint that maybe there's something a little bit more going on. Now, whether or not the game's successful at that, we'll talk more about that in a second. So, but regardless, you do these deeds, you get into the lodge, and n- number one, first of all, the game becomes an action game out of nowhere. I mean, it's not out of nowhere. Like you always have the ability to punch things. I don't really think that it ever interacts with the game outside of like one very brief combat section that's in Act 1. But I don't think you can just like punch people. I don't think they just react to you, right? The weird thing is that you do get like a number of items that you can equip that you can use as weapons throughout Act 1, but then they take them all away from you at the beginning
Oh,
of Act 2.
yeah. Yeah, that is true.
Yeah, so it's kind of like, all right, whatever. I think it should also be said that the combat in this game is absolute garbage. The hit detection is absolute garbage. You die fairly quickly and fairly easily, and there is a health meter that's like on the in the item menu, very Resident Evil inspired. You're probably mostly going to just die very quickly in most combat encounters. And there's a lot of combat in Act 2, with the basic idea being that Stephanie is somewhere in the lodge. You have to get to the end and go through a series of fights as well as a series of point and click puzzles. And the lodge is notable in that it starts you're inside of basically like a human body, which is kinda like a Cronenberg kinda thing, which was a very popular video game aesthetic during this period. Like, there are doors that are out that are supposed to be, like, either human vaginas or human anuses. There are, weird monstrosities that you're fighting at first. That interview that you mentioned, Lamont, that'll also be in the show notes with one of the artists for the game mentioned that like it was actually intentional to have you like fight monstrosities first and then start fighting more human-like enemies towards the end for reasons that has to do with the game's ending. So we'll get into that in a second too. But yeah, you start with fighting these monstrosities, but the further you go in, the more normal the lodge looks. But yeah, like there's a kitchen, there's a bar, you know. But then the game takes another turn after you get past that section, and you end up in an art gallery where there is an art curator who I want to come back to the art curator. I'll skip them for now, but we're gonna be coming back to this art curator because it's kind of the part where the game kind of like unveils the curtain about like what its supposed message is supposed to be. But then you end up, like, specifically, like, fighting, like, these, like, stone statues that are part of the art. You end up fighting, a guy who's very good at chess, who you can either, like, fight in hand-to-hand combat or do a chess puzzle, but regardless, you have to get the key to a room that is specifically lodged in their head. It's actually a very weird sequence. You probably didn't see this one, Lamont. You have
I
to,
did not.
yeah, you have to, like if you solve the chess puzzle, which is actually a very easy puzzle to do, the guy's like, "Well, you beat me," and then his head blows off. He
Oh,
doesn't shoot himself, his head just blows up. And then, like, you have to, like, get the key from his brain matter, and it's, like, one of those, like, first person, like, still pictures where so it's, like, very close up, very detailed for you to get the you have to, like, pull the key from, like, a part of his brain.
Oh. Oh, okay.
Like, and I don't think there's any greater meaning to it than just, again, the game's just trying to do something really gross here. And it's after this point that, like, it becomes a little bit hard to talk about what happens between the action segments and the end of the game. You go through this section where each room has a theme, and there is someone you have to fight that all of them, like, say, like, "This is the room of immolation," and then, like, launches into this, like, weird philosophical discussion with you before you either have to, like, make a very gross choice or you have to do something very heinous. The most infamous example is you walk into one room and there is a woman who is in what can only be described as like a birth-giving position, like, and not wearing anything below her You don't see anything though, because there are 3 the Roses podcast described them as babies or infants. It's not even that. They're like 8-year-olds. These are like 8-year-old boys all eating her legs. Just these or this is like what it's like to be a mother, even though it's like literally 3 kids eating her thighs.
The
Eh,
Giving Tree.
yeah. If you were, Lamont, if you remember, Dawn of the Dead, like the original, like, 70s Dawn of the Dead and, like, how the special effects look, you kinda get an idea of what it looks like, these kids, like, biting into her thighs
Oh
and stuff.
god. Yeah.
And then you have to, kill the 8-year-old kids, all 3 of them. I mean, they're trying to kill you. It's not like you just, like, murder children, murder innocent children. They are trying to murder you as well, but you are expected to just put down and let's remember, it's all live action.
Yep.
It's all live action, so it is like these are, like, pictures of actual children that you have to murder. There's a room with, like, a Roman gladiator that, like, you either have to, like, fight the Roman gladiator or murder 2 old people.
That's a weird choice.
The last room is that you have to fight uh, your fiance's supposed dad in the game who fights you with meat hooks. That character is just he's obsessed with meat. You have to get him cat meat at one point. The aforementioned daughter who got inflicted in the murder-suicide. Yeah, that character actually ends up kidnapping her and implied molests her.
Oh, yeah, that's
And and
right.
you don't actually get to do anything to this guy until the very, very end of the game. He's essentially the final boss. And you're mostly fighting him just to get to the end, not because, he's a heinous child rapist. I say that with no levity, by the way. This is a game that is insanely hard to talk about. But this is why I said, like, in the beginning, like, there's so many little things that happen in this game that just kind of like build up to these moments that you kind of have to experience it for yourself. But again, at the top, like I said, I would prefer you not. Honestly, you should just kind of listen to us rant about it, or watch a Game Grumps playthrough or something like that. But anyway, I digress. At this point, if you are not familiar with this game, if my weird description of all of this is your first time just kind of like experiencing any of this, you might have like heard that I have alluded to, and Lamont has alluded to, that there is sort of a point to all of this, and you might be like wondering to yourself, like, how do you justify any of these things that I have told you in this game that again, I feel like maybe we didn't stress this, is a game that came out in retail stores. You could go to Walmart and buy a Harvester in 1996. How do you justify any of this? So let's talk about the end of the game. At the end of the game, you reach the top where the cultists are. Stephanie is there. She is alive. She is in her underwear, strapped to some kind of torture device. And it is explained to you by the lead lodge person, the person that you've been kind of talking with the entire game, that you are actually in a simulation that has been designed to create serial killers. They are essentially a cult of serial killers who have a VR program to recruit new members, I guess, let's say. Why they go through this elaborate process is never explained. We can talk more about that if we feel like it a little bit later. I don't really think an explanation is really necessary, but that's it. I mean, it's there. Um,
Yep.
so you are Steve. You are a person who is being recruited into this organization of serial killers. They have put you through this
Elaborate.
weird, elaborate, absolutely weird, elaborate, um, VR simulation to try and desensitize you to murder, to get you to be a serial killer, and now you have one last test. If you don't feel that you can do it, and that doesn't seem like the life for you, well, they're not going to let you go, but they will allow you to live in the simulation with Stephanie forever in the world of Harvest, which, I don't know why anyone would want to live in that world, but that's one option. And the other option is you prove that you have what it takes by murdering Stephanie, which she will feel in the real world, even though that Stephanie is a real person. She is not just a VR simulation. She is also a real kidnapped person that Steve from the real world also has no knowledge of. So it's not someone who was ever particularly close to the real Steve, whoever that Steve is. You have the option to murder her. She will feel pain for real when you do it, and then they will take you out of the simulation for you now to be a serial killer. And again, let's emphasize, this is not like an assassination group. They're not going to have like point you to someone to kill. No, you're just becoming a serial killer. That's it. And so you get like another popular video game trope is you have like a moral choice that you have to make at the end to determine which of the two endings in the game that you get. Nothing that you do prior to this matter towards what ending you.
For the record, Adrian, I did watch both endings.
Great. So we have to like move into the second twist of the game then, because there's another one. There's only two endings, but there is another twist.
But wait, there's more.
So like number one, we have this idea of like a VR simulation that is designed to desensitize someone through murder. So, again, I mentioned that like a lot of the rooms that lead up to this final room, you get like some like um pseudo psychobabble from each of the characters. Like all of that stuff is just there to like add to the aesthetic and feel fanciful. None of it really means anything. It really is just about like hey, how much do you want to get your goal? Will you kill an old person to do it? Will you kill these children who are inexplicably eating this their mom's legs for some reason? It's all about like performing actions from a quest giver to be able to finish those actions regardless of how heinous this is. I can almost hear Ken Levine of BioShock fame just like gasping and awing that this idea was done so many years before BioShock.
Okay, that was funny. I actually enjoyed that.
Like so many things that like like few like games that you hear like do all these like crazy narrative things in the future, and I can just like point you to like other games that like did it not like so many times over. But regardless, so if at this point like the idea hasn't become super clear yet, there's the second twist, which only happens in the bad ending. The good ending with Stephanie is just kind of what it is on the label. Like, now you live in Harvest with Stephanie, I guess.
I mean, they make it known that like if you choose that ending,
Mhm.
you and Stephanie are going to die. They are going to kill like real Steve and Stephanie in the real world, but in the few seconds of them being alive in the simulation, like their brain or whatever, they will live a full happy life together, marry and have a family and everything in the simulation, but that entire life that they're living is only seconds before they actually die in the real world.
Right, but and again, it's like, well, if for us it's going to feel like a normal human lifetime, what does that matter, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and, like, I think there's, like, a conversation between 2 of the serial killer scientists or whatever they are, um, too, about, like, them choosing that option or whatever happens in that ending. I don't know, I do feel like I agree, I don't know if that context really adds anything to that ending. It mostly feels inconsequential to me, you know? It's definitely not the real ending. The real ending
No.
is the bad ending in this case.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, I don't know if you had any more there
Um,
about the good ending, if you think there's
I
maybe
mean,
something I'm missing here.
I don't think so. I think really it just boils down to like, we can go with the idea of do we accept the happy fantasy versus the cold reality.
Mhm, right, which the cold reality is, well, you were Steve the whole time. In the actual ending, the second twist that you find is like, well, let's start from the beginning, right? So you choose the serial killer route. You have there's a graphic death for Stephanie that we will hold off on describing here. I actually want to come back to it when we get to like kind of the context for all of this. But then once you come out of the simulation, you see Steve hitchhiking and gets picked up by a random girl who's wearing a ring. They emphasize the ring that she's wearing. It's going to be important later. And, you know, it kind of implies that obviously, you know, Steve murdered her. He's a serial killer now. But then you see him at a computer, like a normal, like giant beige 1990s computer. His mom comes into the room, who I believe is played by the same actress who plays all of the
I
moms
was gonna
in
say all of the
Harvest.
moms.
Every mom in Harvest, because there's like 5 of them, they're all played by the same actress. Yeah, Steve's real mom comes in and is like, "What are you doing?" So he's like, "Playing Harvester," and she's like, "Oh, I wish you wouldn't play that awful game. It's so violent." And he's like, "It's fun, mom." And then, like, he just, like, starts laughing maniacally, and then they, like, do, like, a weird zoom in of his throat where I guess he ate that girl's finger? Did you
So I
see the
will
finger with
say,
the ring? Yeah,
oh yeah, a couple of things.
yeah.
Um, when Steve does choose the bad ending, we'll say, and he comes out, we have to make note that like the first thing that he says is, "Oh, that was fun."
Oh, yeah, yeah, that was fun, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, he enjoyed his time, which I guess I'm glad someone enjoyed their time with Harvester.
So then you see the hitchhiking.
Mhm.
At first, I wasn't sure what he was doing until like you see that he's pulling a knife from like from in his sock, like it's like against his leg, which, as you said, you know, you were really Steve the whole time. I have a feeling the scientists didn't just give him that knife. Like I think Steve was already on the verge of being a serial killer. They just gave him the extra push.
Yeah, well, I mean, the implication seems to be from the game. Like, I don't even know if those scientists really exist. The idea is that Steve is just a kid playing Harvester, who is also a serial killer. That Harvester, the game you were playing. It's like kind of like a meta on top of meta ending,
Ah,
right?
see, there we go. I missed it.
Yeah. No, like the implication seems to be that the game that you were playing Steve, being manipulated by this game that is designed to create serial killers. So it's not even a VR simulation, it is just the game in your PC that you are playing now. Harvester.
Okay, now that makes more sense.
Yeah.
Also, when his mom pops in, she makes sure to say that like, "Oh man," I think she said that like she's heard or read or whatever that consuming violent media makes you a violent person, and then he does the weird laugh.
Mhm. Yeah, how ridiculous, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think that at that point you're kind of like, "Oh, well, okay, now we have a little bit more context." Doing like, you know, again, like you have a quest giver, they have you want to do something horrific, but you have to do it because that's how you beat the game. And if you've made it this far, you know, the game almost it's just again like kind of like being like, "Well, that was a waste of time," or like, well, not even the last time. It's just pointing the finger at you, right?
Yeah.
It's just pointing the finger at you and saying like, like rubbing your nose in it almost. game saying that video games do create violent behavior, or is it that they are just saying that's a ridiculous notion and putting that into a ridiculous game, right? But yeah, this game is clearly one that has something to say about video game violence, and that was the point. I don't know if that makes up for any of the content in the game, but I feel like that's probably what the rest of this podcast is going to be about.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely, like, now that we've talked about what the game wanted to do, I guess that's my question for you, Adrian. Do you feel like it succeeded in trying in that message?
I mean, for me, it boils down to, like, again, which one was it? And, I feel like there's also a argument to be made that maybe it is up to you. Maybe there wasn't something that they were trying to say. Except that I remember reading in one of the interviews with Gilbert Austin that absolutely there is an answer to what their intention was with this, which is that it was kinda ridiculous. So, I wanna put a pin actually in your question, Mont, and we'll come back to it in a little bit. Let's actually kinda talk a little bit about, like, the creation of this game and the why surrounding it, how we even get to this point. Because again, we're gonna kinda double back onto, like, that idea of, like, their intent and whether or not they were successful in it, right? But we kinda need that a little bit more grounding there. The interesting thing to me is that I've read a couple of different sources about when the game actually, like, began development, like, the interview that we're gonna post in the show notes says that I think they started development around 1991, which mean if that's true, this game went through a 5-year development cycle, which by today's standards is fairly typical. By the 1990s standards, that's actually a very long time, and I'm honestly surprised the game wasn't canceled. Mhm,
Considering, yeah, game development in the early '90s like that,
mhm.
like, that is a long cycle, but and they do
Yeah.
explain why.
So, and this is where becomes confusing for me for that 1991 date, right? Because supposedly the idea was to have this game come out around the time of the 1993 Senate hearings on video games and violence. So I want to do a little bit of background on that. We're not going to go into the complete history because that can be its own podcast, right? But for the record, like that conversation, that Senate hearing happened in December of 1993. I don't know, and I don't have the on my notes here, like, when, like, they first said that they were going to do it. Like, politics moves fairly slowly. It was probably a few months before actually, like, when they all came to the table together, that December. But Harvester, if the goal for Harvester was to get it out in terms of the Senate hearings, like, I can't imagine that have been their modus operandi in 1991, because this is something that, like, kind of bubbled up over time with video games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. Mortal Kombat, especially going to be one that's very relevant to this discussion.
Yeah, I was just about to say, yeah, yep. I that's whenever I think of the Senate 1993, like, Mortal Kombat is the, reason for the season.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a really important one. So I can't square the idea of them starting development of this game in 1991 and specifically intending it to be directed at the Senate hearings. I do believe that this game is a reaction to those Senate hearings, and it's very clearly got a lot of thoughts about games, media, and violence, all of which I wanna pick apart. So I definitely believe that that was something that was on their minds throughout the development of this game and something that, like, is baked into the messaging of the game. I just have a hard time believing that that means that the game started development in 1991. Like, I could see the beginning of 1993, I could see, like, late 1992, I could see, like, them pivoting the direction of the game somewhere in there, which makes me really curious what, like, some of their early discussions for what the game was going to be before the final gross thing that we actually ended up getting. But yeah, so that's kinda where I'm at on that. For our purposes, for this discussion, I'm just gonna kind of assume that the development started a little bit later, and that, again, the intention was to release this, if not directly on, but, like, sometime after the Senate hearings happened. They missed their mark by about 3 years, and my understanding is that when the game came out, like, no one really cared. I I know that, like, it caused some controversy in Europe. It got banned in certain locations that it couldn't be sold and such in Europe. Totally believe that it happened. Again, considering how deep this like content goes, like yes, the Senate hearings and the conversation on video game violence had mostly waned by the time we got to 1996. I refuse to believe that this game would not have been a controversy. I think the only reason this game was not controversial in the United States is because no one bought it.
Honestly, I can agree with that. What's funny too is that, like, and I don't know if you were gonna get to this later, but the fact that, the creator, the writer, Alston is his name,
Mm.
right?
Yeah, Austin Gilbert.
Yeah. The fact that, like, he petitioned to have Harvester put on, like, a list of games that are, like, the most violent games, like, Harvester wasn't even on the list, and, like, he had to, like, be like, "No, wait, my game deserves to be on this list."
Yeah, like, definitely, like, really trying hard to court controversy, and, like, I don't wanna get into the full tangent here, but, there are other games that, like, are known in game history to have, like, only sold because of their controversy, like Custer's Revenge and Death Race. But the truth of the matter is that the controversy in Death Race's case did not add to their sales, or if it did add to their sales, it added very little. And Custer's Revenge, like, the controversy actively hurt that game. Like, there is actually very little truth to the at least in games, there seems to be very little truth to that idea that, like, controversy is equals sales. But, no one talked about Wolfenstein 3D either. And Wolfenstein was a super popular game, but, like, no one was talking about PC games. No one usually looked at PC games back then.
Oh, yeah, that's so true.
Like, console was what was in the mainstream as well as arcade. People cared a lot more about that with games like Mortal Kombat. I think, honestly, Lieberman probably didn't know Wolfenstein 3D was a thing.
Oh, I'm sure.
So, this is gonna be one of my first questions to you, Lamont. What do you remember about the Senate hearings? Like, because yeah, I want you to kinda, like, pull from your memory. I already said I read game magazines and everything. I was following, like, stuff like this even at a very young age. Like, do you remember what you heard about the Senate hearings back then? Or, like, what kinda is your memory of that period?
So, I was younger. Yeah, we've talked about this before.
Yep.
I'm not a whole lot younger, but you have to figure that, I was born in '85, so that makes me, what, 7?
That sounds about right, and to be clear, I was born in '84, so
Yeah, that's what I mean, like, and so I was following games, but, I mean, probably not that close. At the same time, I was playing a lot of games, like, I talk about, like, when Mortal Kombat came out, like, I had Mortal Kombat. I had a Sega Genesis. Not only did I have Mortal Kombat, I memorized the blood code ABACABB.
famous Genesis album.
Absolutely. I remember, vaguely, like, the controversy and talking about video, like, violence in video games and stuff like that, but at the same time, for me at the time, like, it didn't nothing changed for me. I
Yeah, for
guess,
sure.
yeah, I
Mhm.
guess, my family at the time, like, they weren't really looking at that either.
Yeah, no, and I think that makes sense. So again, for me, like, I'm mostly getting this from game magazines, right? I'm not really seeing what they're airing on TV or anything about that, and I don't think my family was talking about it. And to hear the conversation in game magazines, you would be led to believe that, like, a bunch of old politicians who don't know anything about, like, video games, they don't know what they're talking about, they're trying to censor video games, and that's, what these hearings are about effectively is censorship because of content in games, which, and everybody game journalism was in a very different place back then than it would be, in the internet era, which is basically, a bunch of 20 somethings just kind of writing about an enthusiast hobby. It's not really like something that a lot of people were taking very seriously at the time. So most of it was just kind of filtered through this idea of, like, the man getting in the way of our video games. And that was what I kind of took from it at the time. Like I was not the biggest fan of Joseph Lieberman and kind of saw him as the enemy for a long time. It wasn't until like a lot later that I found out. And then, because that is still how I think those Senate hearings are thought of in a lot of popular history that you'll read on the internet. It wasn't until a lot later that found out that, like, yes, some of that is absolutely true. Yes, it is true that, like, Joseph Lieberman talked about a lot of stuff that in the game Night Trap, a game that we'll probably cover on this podcast someday, and honestly, we probably should have covered it first. Oops. That, he made a lot of claims about the game that weren't true. You do not get rewarded for murdering women. You are trying to save the women in Night Trap. You are not skinning them alive and putting them on meat hooks. That is not something that happens in what is a fairly tame video game, right? Like those are all things that Joseph Lieberman said, and absolutely, yeah, that wasn't accurately misrepresented. The only thing that the senators and the politicians were looking to do in those debates was for the game industry to create a rating system, or at the very least put something on the box akin to, like, the explicit lyrics label that also was like, created around that time period. I'm not a music historian, and I should say that there is a lot of loaded stuff that goes into that conversation about, like, the history of rap music, for example. Um, and there are certainly problems with the MPAA, like the rating system for movies as well. But like for the most part, I don't think that we bat an eye at the explicit lyrics label. I don't think we bat an eye at the fact that the MPAA has a rating system. And yeah, looking back at it now in, what effectively was the result of those Senate hearings, the creation of the ESRB, the ratings that are on every video game. Yeah, it's kinda weird games didn't have a rating system.
Yeah, yeah, no, it absolutely, like, it's still a media that is being consumed, and having some sort of rating system, it kinda makes sense.
Yeah, especially as games were starting to move into like photorealism territory with Mortal Kombat. And I want to be clear, Mortal Kombat absolutely was being aimed at kids. It had an explicit content warning on its attract screen, and then it literally would go right to like watching players fight inside of the pit where they had decapitated heads of all the developers. Like very gruesome, very detailed and gory, right? But, like, even on top of that, like, Lamont, I'm gonna put this in the chat, it'll be in the show notes, this ad for the arcade version of Mortal
Oh,
Kombat.
yeah, yeah. Those are and I remember this ad. Sorry, first off, that takes me back, but second of all, yeah, like, this ad flat out shows you that they were targeting kids.
It was fun. I brought this up in my game history class, and I asked if anybody remembers Joe the Camel, and I had to explain what Joe the Camel was to a bunch of Gen Zs.
Oh, weird.
Yeah, with, like, this basically the same idea of, like, the tobacco industry aiming their marketing at kids, right? And even, like, I feel like Joe the Camel, like, there's a little bit of an argument there, but, like, I mean, this Mortal Kombat ad, it's just so ridiculous. And, like, I think there's also a long conversation to be had there about, like, the marketing and aiming at kids with this and whether or not kids should have this because, um it's only gonna be a few years later that, like, we get into the conversation about Grand Theft Auto, and I absolutely remember, parents letting their ten-year-olds play Grand Theft Auto San Andreas.
I as we were talking about the Senate hearings, I was like, "Oh, yeah, that's right." Like, the '93 ones, I wasn't, like, really in the know. For, like, the hot coffee mod ones? No, I remember those.
Yeah, when we get to, like, Jack Thompson and, like, the pundits of that era, absolutely. I'm gonna try to, like, limit that conversation because again, I could talk all day about that, but also, Harvester. God, if Jack Thompson ever played Harvester, the game that actually is a murder simulator.
Oh my god.
So, Harvester is absolutely like being made in this era. I mean, the game is essentially a response to the Senate hearings. The problem was is that it was 3 years too late. But just to like kind of seal that point, I wanna go back to Stephanie's death. And actually, even before that, the way that you initiate Act 2 of the game, the last thing that you have to do is that they kind of do a fake out of Stephanie's death, and you have to, like, break into her crypt and get a skull and spine. That's like the initiation into the lodge is a skull and spine.
Mhm.
And then when you kill Stephanie, Steve shoves his hand into her neck after, like, opening up her head and then rips out her skull and spine in a pose that looks very, very familiar.
It's funny because, like, I've got 2 screens open, and right now, I have the, 1993 and 1994 United States Senate hearings on video games, and in the box, there is Sub-Zero doing that fatality.
Right, yeah, absolutely, like, it is an explicit reference to that fatality, and so from the interviews that I've read, Gilbert Austin specifically said that it's like, okay, well, that idea seems like very silly. This idea of like, what if a video game, could like turn someone into a murderer, right? Like taking that argument on its face and creating something around that. What kills me personally is that, like, again, that was the popular conception of what the Senate hearing was about, and certainly that was something that, like, seemed to be a bugbear of Lieberman in particular. But that's not actually what those Senate hearings was about. And in fact, Jimmy Marr of the Digital Antiquarian actually did a really, really good essay breaking down the Senate hearing and its eventual results, which is the ESRB rating, but also some other things that are like out of scope of this podcast. And I'm gonna link to that article in the show notes. But something that Marr points out is that, like, in 1994, when they reconvened, like Nintendo, Howard Lincoln from Nintendo came back, and someone else from Sega, senior vice president, came in. They got like the guy who's the president of Electronic Arts at the time, and they were like, okay, we have this ESRB system that we're going to do. We've got an industry wide standard for video game ratings. And Lieberman was like, good job. Like, that was it.
Mhm.
That was the entirety of the 1994 follow-up. And at some point, someone from the video game side of things said that, like, it was kinda like the idea that games could transfer to real life violence. Like, Lieberman actually stopped it and was like, "I think we've talked enough about that." Like, it's so funny and sort of frustrating to me, and, this is its own tangent, that to this day, we are still having that conversation about, like, whether or not video games, like, or violent media will actually cause someone to be violent. They were doing it long before those Senate hearings with movies and such, and, that conversation just got transferred right to video games. Like, even in 2018, 2019, those conversations were heating up again because of the rampant school shootings that were happening prior to the pandemic and COVID lockdown. And I'm just so frustrated and tired of the conversation because it just, like, it's always the same things over and over again. I feel like by this point it's pretty clear and obvious that no, a violent video game is not going to make someone act more violent. A violent television show is not going to make someone act more violent. But there are still more interesting conversations to be having around that topic, beyond just that, but we just keep circling around these conversations. And, even Harvester, which we're going to get to, I think actually does have more interesting things to say about violence in media and desensitization, but it was born out of the same misconception of this very cyclical argument that frankly I'm kind of sick of.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, like, and it definitely feels like as, as technology advances and we move forward in that tech space, it still always comes down to that same conversation of, like, is consuming this media in whatever this new format is that is more interactive than the last format going to create more violent people?
Yeah, and again, like, I think that argument is at this point fairly soundly patently false. It's tr
Yeah.
but as I was kind of alluding to with the conversation about, like, Mortal Kombat's ad campaign and such, I think there are still interesting conversations to be had and other more important parts of this conversation that no one wants to seem to engage with. Lamont, I got a quick question for you. Between Gen X, millennials, Gen Z, who do you think hates boomers more?
Ooh. Oh, man. If I'm gonna wow. I feel like for Gen Z, boomers are more of a joke, but I feel like Gen X has a solid hate for boomers. And I thinking about growing up in the shadow of the boomers, how like that culture clash, the Gen X attitude of like the F this attitude of Gen X when it came to their boomer parents. I don't know, man. I think Gen X has it covered.
So I'm so happy to hear you say that because like I feel like you could make an argument for any of the three, right? But yeah, it's been kind of a pet theory of mine that a lot of the 90s edginess that we have been talking about is very specifically a Gen X reaction to its boomer upbringing. And I want to clarify for any of my game history fellows or peers who might be listening to this. I say this is a pet theory. I have not done any real research into this. It is a theory and idle speculation, but I feel like it's grounded in a lot. So the console wars era, which is basically the same period that we've been talking about, like 92 to like 94, 95, between Sega and Nintendo, where Sega had like, I mean, both Nintendo and Sega, but particularly Sega was very famous for its like attack ads, right? And, Sega wasn't the only one making ads like this. These almost kinda like they have the vibe and aesthetic. I'm not saying that they are experimental art pieces, but they sorta have the vibe of a '90s experimental art piece that often gets labeled as kinda like the "Hello Fellow Kids" meme, that it's like a bunch of old people, like, making, like, very cynical, rebellious, quote, unquote, media specifically to appeal to kids and teenagers at the time. I don't agree. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I actually don't think that's true. Yes, they are commercials that are meant to sell a product. And yes, there are absolutely a lot of old boomer execs who are greenlighting these commercials. They're not the people actually making them. Like your directors, your writers, your costume people, etc., etc. The people who are traditionally the people who are behind the lens, the people who are the creative force, are like, especially in the realm of commercials, they're your up and comers. They're
Mhm.
your 20 somethings, who are, trying to be creative. And, this is, before the time of like everything is put through an algorithm to be like the most effective, right? So they have a little bit more of a degree of creative control. So you get a lot of, like, really weird off the wall stuff during the '90s, and, I'm specifically bringing up the console wars ads and Sega's ads because I felt like they did this a lot. A very common theme that you saw in '90s children's media, and I say media, not just commercials, you saw this in cartoons and everything too, was using the aesthetics of the '50s, specifically, like 1950s Americana kitsch
Oh, yeah.
in a very satirical light, right? One example that I'm gonna put in the show notes that I'm posting for Lamont right now is this commercial from Sega, their Bully commercial, which is very much like in the style of like a 1950s public service announcement. These shorts that they actually made you watch in school about like how to groom yourself properly,
I remember this commercial,
how to go on dates. Yeah,
like I'm watching it as we speak. Wow.
You hear that, like, announcer voice, right? "Young Bobby Engels has a problem." It is very much, like, heralding to this time period that, again, like, the satire here is very clearly meant to be I mean, for kids, and this is, like, peak, like, Nickelodeon kids rule the world, like, period, this kind of boomer 1950s aesthetic is tied to authority. It is tied to the adults who rule the world, right? At this point, and that's why they use it in like such a kind of like usually kind of surrealistic, very absurd sort of way. It's sort of like a again, it's sort of a statement of rebellion. I don't want to put a lot of like prestige onto what are effectively like commercials and children's cartoons, but like I don't think this is coming from nowhere. I feel like a lot of this again is very much like a Gen X reaction uh to the generation that preceded them and the things that they don't like about them. Stuff is more of an admiration for the stuff that they grew up on. And, the reason I'm bringing all of this up is, well, what time period is being satirized in Harvester?
Ah, yes, that's right. If I remember, it takes place, like, I think it's, like, 1953.
Yeah, it's designed very much to look like 1950s idyllic America, and a lot of that, like, Americana stuff is very, very harshly looked at. Your mom is baking cookies for a bake sale that is a week later, and she is locked in the kitchen just making cookies constantly, throwing out the bad ones and just trying to get them right for this bake sale. And she is locked in the kitchen there. So, it's playing with that stereotype, but it's also very heavily satirizing it.
Mhm.
And more pertinent to this conversation about games and violence and such, I want to go back to your brother. And I want to go back to the TV station that is just showing cowboy shows. That is a genre that had effectively died by the time we got to the late 90s, but was still at least in the cultural memory. Like, I don't know how many kids growing up today would know what Bonanza is, but you and me, Lamont, like Bonanza was still have a lot of reruns
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
back then. Some of the older, like much older black and white shows had been forgotten. I think like maybe Gunsmoke was one that was still airing, probably in syndication.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you're right.
Right? But, like, that was super popular media, and so there seems to be this idea that permeates throughout all of Harvester that, like, "Hey, boomers grew up with a lot of really messed up media." Now, obviously, like, the Native Americans that were depicted in a lot of these older shows, while those depictions were also pretty awful, they weren't being, like, mercilessly butchered, like, on TV with a 10-year-old just, like, being glued to it. But Harvester does seem to be kind of, like, pointing at this notion that it's like, "Hey, maybe it's not good for a kid to, like, grow up with this, like, idea being planted in their head." Also very similar during that time period were, like, notions of, like, the Red Scare and communists, in your backyard, like, that kind of, like, McCarthy kinda era, like, that was stuff that you saw constantly being played with in a lot of old TV shows and such, and those attitudes are being kinda regurgitated back at you by a lot of the people in Harvest, right? Like, not for nothing, like, this game is kind of like saying, well, if game media could have affected us, well, maybe, like, again, like, kinda, like, look in the mirror, bub, like, look at the stuff that you grew up on, look at some of the attitudes that you hold, which I like, that's interesting. That's actually kinda fascinating.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, and definitely, like, going into Harvester, not something I really thought about, but, really diving into that makes sense to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, again, I think one segment that, like, really kinda, like, seals it, like, we're going like, talking about this idea of, like, who hates Gen X the most. Like, we haven't talked about the school at all. There's a segment of the game well, a couple of times when you have to, like, go to the elementary school that's there, and the teacher of the school is very weirdly into corporal punishment, who is like, and like when we say corporal punishment, I'm not just like talking about like your stereotypical Catholic nun hitting kids with rulers. Like she has a baseball bat. At one point, there is a nuclear missile drill, just like you would see in, like, again, a 50s PSA, right? Where the kids, like, get down under their desk, like, hold their heads, and then one kid looks up and says, like, "Why are we doing this? We would still die. This is pointless." At which point she, like, kinda shadow just starts beating the kid with the baseball bat, implied that she murdered that child. I mean, like, this idea of mine, like, that this game is, like, very much satirizing, like, the boomer perspective, like, the same people who are criticizing video games. I feel like the game is not subtle about any of this.
Yeah, no, no. Like having this conversation, it's something that, as I said earlier, I didn't think about. Like that, it didn't occur to me. But no, it makes sense. We're talking about like the generation that was okay, or were being spanked in school. That was a thing. And like, there's always the I grew up with this and I turned out just fine and you'll do the same. And that definitely is the Gen X like rebellion, saying that like just because you grew up with it doesn't mean we need to.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the thing. Here's my question. Is that what it's saying? Because it seems to also be saying that, like, that boomers were, like, fed a lot of political and religious propaganda that has shaped their worldview.
Oh yeah, and it is definitely a call out to like to that, but it's also, I think, it is a message to their fellows. It's a message to, others in that in their, in their generation, to say like, isn't this ridiculous?
Because yeah, like, number one, I 100% agree with you. That is definitely very much that, like, kinda Gen X mindset that it's like, "I grew up with this, so it'll be okay for you as well," and I think that that kind of informed a lot of things, like, we definitely had a lot of kids who were like, I think you might remember when, like, horror movies were really popular with little kids, or the fact that, like, we got, like, the RoboCop cartoon.
Oh my god, yes.
So, like, and, I think part of that too is just good old Reagan America economics. If we can sell it, who cares?
I mean, look, I watch the Toxic Crusaders? Of course I did.
Right, yeah, and actually I feel like trauma is also very relevant to this conversation too, and, we'll get to the exploitation film, angle in just a little bit. If I wanna circle back to your question about, like, whether or not this game is successful in its messaging, right? And I think honestly, like, I find all of this stuff very fascinating. I find that they say at one point in an interview, Gilbert Austin has specifically said this is supposed to be about how ridiculous this idea is. But it also plays it very straight when it says that it's like, well, you watched a lot of media that put a lot of ideas in your heads too, and you are worse off for it. Like it did affect or normalize your worldview in very horrific ways. I do not think that it is an accident, again, that the people who Steve's actions directly most affect are minorities and women.
And yeah, yeah, that's a good point.
So if the idea is that this game, like that, like, no, it is absolutely ridiculous that, and this is just an over the top absurdist idea and is ridiculous that, like, your media has would have a direct effect on someone, and yet it has so many, like, examples of exactly how media could have an effect on someone. And I think that those are the kinds of things that, like, really end up muddling the message, because I will say that, like, we have Gilbert Austin on record saying what this game is trying to say, and yeah, I don't know that it actually does succeed in that. It seems very muddled. And that is before you get into the fact that, like, it is very clearly criticizing the racism, misogyny, and homophobia of the previous generation, while also absolutely playing into the misogyny, racism, and homophobia of the 90s, of which you and me are very well aware of now, and here in 2024, looking back on a lot of the things that we grew up with.
Oh god, yeah.
Yeah, so, like, this is definitely an example of a game trying to have its cake and eat it too. I think, like, the most clear example going back to Act 2, one of those rooms you have to go into, forces you or otherwise you die, it forces you to have sex with a sex worker, and then you contract a venereal disease that slowly kills you until you get an antidote later. Yeah, that's not cool.
No. No.
And, like, it doesn't seem like there's any message to be had there. Also, Leisure Suit Larry technically did it first, so,
I wasn't gonna say that, but yeah.
the firemen, for example, like, I think that the game is ultimately compassionate towards them, but also, again, very heavily playing into the 90s stereotype without any sense of irony whatsoever, so, you know some of the content really does kind of like push itself way, way too far, which is kind of the last thing I want to talk about. So I want to jump into kind of talking about this game as a piece of exploitation media, or whether or not it is exploitation media. But before we do that, I just wonder, if do you have any other like kind of final thoughts on this idea of whether or not this game kind of succeeds at its like supposed messaging of, does violent media create violent people, or at the very least create, like, normalize the idea of violence?
I haven't experienced the entire game. I'm gonna go with that. Ultimately, no, I don't think it accomplishes its mission. When you show and lean into all of the things that you're against, when you're like, "Hey, we're going to make fun of this thing because we know that, like, you shouldn't make fun of it. We know that, like, it's being exploited. We know, but at the same time, we're gonna put it in there and put it in your face and full force, do the thing." Like, it's like, "Alright, cool. You're still showing everything. You're still doing the thing. You can't get it both ways."
So, I mentioned back when we were kinda given the overview of, like, the kinda story beats, or the major story beats, at least of the game. I mentioned that, like, in Act 2, you end up in this, like, art museum, right? And the first thing you see is, like, an art curator. And when you're talking to them, he has this kinda little rant that I posted pictures of it in the Discord, Lamont, for you to look this over.
Oh, I'm reading it right now.
I mostly did this for me so that, like, I didn't get the words of what he was saying wrong, and he says, like, "When confronted with a work of hideous form, or, like, an art that is hideous, you're forced to deal with it, even if only to dismiss it as trash. Sadly, the most extreme works are the hardest to dismiss. Grotesqueries amid works of beauty are necessary. That should be taken for granted. Nevertheless, it's important that each individual determines his own sense of aesthetic." So, this is a very, very common thing that you hear when discussing works that are specifically meant to shock. That, as it says, forces you to deal with it. It almost like it is like most things you can just kind of like walk by and just ignore, or you can like kind of dismiss out of hand, like, say, for example, a painting that is mostly a single color or just two colors in something. And, like, people, there are certain people out there, I don't subscribe to this worldview, but a lot of people will be like, well, I could just do that and just kind of move on with their lives. But then you have something like, say, a crucified Jesus depiction in a jar of someone's piss. A lot harder to not have an opinion on that. A lot
Yeah.
harder to just, like, completely dismiss it. And this really does kinda feel like the game kinda, like, giving away, almost just, like, outright stating what it's trying to do here. So, we've already said there is a lot of extreme stuff that has happened in this game. I haven't even talked about, like, the sequence with the baby whose eyes pop out of its skull, and then, like, the mom puts the baby's eyes back in. Not It's not that graphic because it's, like, honestly very poorly done, but it is a thing that happens in this game, right? Like, this game is going out of its way to try and disgust you. cannibalism, the cat meat, the factory that just kills cats, the killing the children who were eating their mom's legs, like all this stuff that like it's hard for me to even say it because it's so extreme, it's so in your face, and here is the game like literally just telling you that it's like, well, like even like that can also be considered art because it's forcing a reaction. If art's job is to make you react, that's what we're doing. We're forcing you to react. I could go on and I got other stuff I want to point to, but like I kind of like Lamont, what do you feel with this statement? Like, do you agree with this idea? Do you disagree with this idea? Do you think Harvester is doing anything particularly interesting with this?
Uh, mm, mm, my face as we're talking about this just became kind of a weird lemon.
Yeah, we're both on Discord and we can't we each of us can't see each other, so yeah, we don't have cameras.
No. I mean, yeah, I guess it forces me to deal with it. Like the game, yeah, I guess that's not wrong. I don't think that's art necessarily. I don't I don't know on this one, man. Like I'm trying, but
And like I wouldn't even go like for me, like I want to be very clear for those folks listening out there. I don't think either me or Lamont are prudes. Like we seen some like really like messed up stuff. I mean, but like Lamont already said at a young age watching freaking a toxic adventure. Like the works of Trauma are almost like a perfect comparison, but like even the Trauma movies kind of I hate to use this word. It's so loaded, but, like, that's the difference to me between something that's pretentious and something that's not, right? Like, it's a word that gets thrown around way too much and is not usually used by bad faith actors who don't really know what that word means. The Trauma movies know exactly what they are, and they don't have any, like, notion of being anything more than that.
yes, no, I actually do completely agree with that. Like they know exactly what they're doing. You know, they are not trying to hide behind like art house.
You know, in the lead up to this conversation, like, I've been talking to Lamont about Harvester for a little bit here, and I think it's very clear that like Harvester is a work of exploitation. And I don't think that Gilbert Austin would disagree with this. I think that like that is something they are specifically like pulling from. They are pulling from works of exploitation films and exploitation media. I think they're pulling from that. I think that like Gilbert Austin has probably thought about exploitation media quite a bit and poured a lot of his own thoughts about exploitation into this game and into characters like this art curator here. And I've been struggling to kind of like come up with a genre name for media that is exploitative that tries to also have a message. The point of comparison for me and Mont has always been this movie Ken Park. I don't know how many people listening to this would be familiar with Ken Park. I am not going to go into the plot of that movie here. There's not enough time for it. But like that's a movie that like I would say is like it is exploitative. It does have a message. It does have something it's trying to say. I had to like hear it from someone else and then really think about it to realize that. It mostly just kinda like was just kinda like, well, I watched that and I kinda feel gross having watched that. That was my feeling finishing Ken Park. And it's like, I know this is exploitation, but, like, you have exploitation, like, again, like Toxic Avenger, the Trauma films, like, again, I don't think they have any doubt in what they are, right? And they're not trying to say anything more with them than other than just being a movie that is also trying to be as extreme as they can. And they're doing other things too. There are like, definitely people's, like, political views and such that they wanna, like, put into those movies. So those are coming out depending on which Trauma picture we're talking about. Like, not saying there's nothing there, but they're not trying to be anything more than what they are, as opposed to, say, like, something like a Ken Park, or in this case, Harvester. I hate to do it, but, like, I don't know that there is a better word than pretentious. I think it's pretentious exploitation.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to go with that. Yeah.
Yeah, again, I hate it because, like, I feel like anything that tries to say anything or even, like, has the gall to have an actor have a monologue that's more than 5 minutes usually gets hand waved as pretentious. That's why I hesitate to use that term. It's so loaded and gets thrown at so many, like, excellent, good bodies of work. I don't think that's what Harvester is, and I don't think that's what Ken Park is.
I mean, my only other thing is, as you were saying that, is that it is exploitation with an ego.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's a great phrasing. I love that. Yeah, I think that honestly is probably what bugs me the most about Harvester when I, like, really think about stuff like this art curator or, like, even the violent game messaging and again, like, kind of the waving its finger at you at the end because you did all those horrible things to get to to get to the end of the game. I don't know, there's just, like, a stuck-upness about it that makes me just wanna say, "Well, fuck you, buddy, you put a fucking cat murder factory in your game." Like, and also, again, like, if you, like, have anything interesting to say, it's just getting muddled by all of the, like but that's the thing, is that, like, Harvester is absolutely trying to offend. I'm not offended by Harvester.
Oh, certainly not.
By the time you get to the end, the serial killer VR twist, I'm mostly kinda like, "Okay," like, "That's it? That's all you got at the end of all of this?" For all of the extremes and all the nastiness that it's trying to do, and then on top of all of that, it's not even very fun to play. This is also a very controversial statement among, like, the games as art folk out there. I do not think that video games need necessarily to be fun. I think that there are a lot of other forms of expression out there that you can do with games. And, me and you, Ma, doing a horror podcast, like, that's something that we talk about actively with a lot of games, including, like, the really commercial ones.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
When I say the game isn't fun, I mean, like, not even in the way not because it's gross. It's not fun because, like, the puzzles aren't particularly engaging. It has a really bad conversation system where it has an optional, uh, typing parser that I think you never actually have to use in the game, and, its menu selection for selecting dialogue is extremely confusing. The second half of the game is a completely different genre that's busted and doesn't work. Like, it's not fun for none of the right reasons. That's why I'm kind of baffled, honestly, that, like, folks who are discovering the game for the first time are enjoying it. And I'm baffled that there are some folks who played it back in the day who are like, oh, who are champions of this game. Like, and if you are one of those people, as I always say, like, this is all subjective. That's fine. Like, you can like Harvester. It's fine. I do not think you are an awful person for liking Harvester despite its weird offensive content. Like, that is not my issues with the game. It's just that the weird offensive content like adds nothing and if anything just like muddles its message. But that being said, I do think there are interesting things there. So, it's not like I 1,000% hate this game. If I did, I probably wouldn't have, spent the last hour ranting about it.
No, and, like, as I said, I had not heard of this game before, and, I don't feel like I came out of it necessarily enriched, but it definitely is a game that is worthy of a conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because, like, that's the conclusion I feel like everyone comes to when they talk about Harvester. At the end of the Game Grumps playthrough, they say, well, we at least had a conversation about it, like it did get us to talk about this thing. They kind of say the same thing in the Save Your Game podcast that again, all of these things will be linked in the show notes, where I feel like they kind of have more positive feelings about the game overall than you and me did, Ma, although they also said that, the game's message is very muddled by the time you get to the end of it. But yeah, it is a game that forces discussion for those that did, and you, Lamont, are a parent of a young child today.
I am too, in fact.
like I said earlier on, the biggest thing is that I'm mostly just kinda, like, sick of the conversation that we usually have, because it always feels very cyclical. It feels like we're always, like, kinda going over a lot of the same points. But, like, again, not for nothing, it's like, I have been playing violent games my entire life, whether my family knew about all of them or not is another point of discussion, like, and I am someone who also enjoys a lot of exploitation media. I am one who likes, various different types of content. I am no prude, but, like, none of this is not to say that, like, over time, have not developed my own feelings of, for lack of a better term, like, think of the children, right? Like, we got done talking about, like, the Mortal Kombat thing, and I talked about, like, how the ad is specifically, like, focused on kids. Like, I feel that there is enough time has passed that I feel comfortable saying that, yeah, no, I absolutely was bothered by all the parents who let their kids play Grand Theft Auto. I honestly, here in 2024, I more worry about stuff like Fortnite than I do whatever. I guess Mortal Kombat is still a thing in 2024.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah, I still yeah, but, like, Fortnite, God, talking about Joe the Camel, like, that to me is like acceptable gun violence for kids. Like, it is violence without gore. And I'm not gonna lie, like, that bothers me a little bit, that that's just, like, a thing that is now just normalized, because that, again, one of the things that Harvester is pointing at that I think is interesting about it is this idea that, like, hey, people grew up on a lot of media that reinforced a lot of not cool ideas in their head. Like, not for nothing, I think there are interesting discussions to be having here that we usually don't have. And I'm glad that, like, Harvester touches on them a little, but I kind of want to hear your thoughts on this, Ma, as someone who has a lot more skin in the game than I do.
I mean, I have to think about that one because, like, growing up with video games and the internet, I have both been very actively involved in, like, what my kids watch and absorb, but at the same time, I do accept that, like, I can't know everything. I would like to know everything. I can't know everything. So, like, especially as they get older, but what never whenever my kids bring something to me, I try to participate, but on the same time, like, at the same time, I also try to, like, ask them what the appeal is.
Mm,
Because for me, like, I wanna understand, like, if they like something, what is the thing that they're enjoying in it? Like, that's what I try to understand. Because if it's the violence or if it's anything like that, then, like, I feel like that's a conversation, like, but, like, there's for me as a parent, I just anything that they absorb, anything that they're experiencing, I wanna know. That's my question. Like, what are you getting out of this? Like, what are you enjoying about it? Like, tell me more.
yeah, for sure, absolutely. And, like, you allude to a couple of things that have been on my mind with this conversation, is that, like, one of the things that usually gets bandied about by folks who are just like, all violence in games or media or whatever is fine, is this idea of, like, well, it should be up to the parents, right? Like, and the parents should be playing stuff with their kids. They should be watching what their kids are doing at all, and having those discussions. And kudos to you for doing that where you can. But as you alluded to, you can't always, right? You can't be there 24/7. You as a parent also have a job.
Yeah.
Like, you have work, you have things to do, and also, frankly, like, it would be nice if we could all be 100% into everything that our kids are into, but, like, that's also an unrealistic expectation, especially in, going from one generation to the next. Like, there's only so much I feel like a parent can do, and that is even more true now in 2024 than it was in 1996 before YouTube was a thing.
Oh god, yeah.
Like, and, we I think every kid of every generation, whether it's been like hiding Playboys under a mattress or, you know, sneaking certain websites they're not supposed to be seeing. There's always we always invent brand new ways for kids to learn about the world faster than their parents would sometimes like.
Oh, that is an absolute truth.
And I don't know, there does seem to be a balance that needs to be struck because I'm not necessarily calling for like government intervention here or anything. I mean, I do think certain regulations do help with certain things in some places. Like that is absolutely something that I think. But also I think that like game developers do have a responsibility for the content that they create and who it is for and why. I don't think that they should be the arbiters. I don't think it and I don't think that they completely shoulder the burden, but I do think that it is something that they do should think about. And, again, it's why, when we talk about the Senate hearings and such, I do think that the senators, as misguided in some of their thoughts were, and a lot of stuff I absolutely don't agree with, the fact that they were just looking for common sense industry oversight. Yeah, that was again, rating systems make sense. Like, again, you can't be there 100% of the time, so hey, it's cool that there is other resources that you have available to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, and it's I a lot of it's at a glance, but at least that's something.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, and again, I'm not 100% bothered that like Harvester was a game that was sold on store shelves. It's so funny like with a film like say Ken Park, that was not a movie that you're just going to be able to go to Blockbuster. Can't just rent Ken Park, right?
No.
Those were the kinds of movies that, like, you kinda watched on a dare, like, everyone on, like, your college dorm knew about it and, like, whispers and, like, would just, like, kinda, like, pass around the burnt DVD or whatever, whereas Harvester was just a commercial game that you could go and buy, and again, no one did.
Yep.
And so, despite making a game that they absolutely wanted everyone to talk about and really tried their best to make sure that would happen, no one ultimately did. Not for almost 20 years at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, close to it.
All right. I think that's going to wrap it up for us on this topic. Do we have any last words or thoughts on Harvester?
Honestly, no, like I feel like we've said a lot about Harvester. And as I said, like ultimately, you know, I would probably not come back to it. But as we've said and kind of everybody else has said, the conversations that we can have like around it, I think there's value in that. But did that come from like Harvester? It was that the point that they were trying to make when they made this game? I don't think so.
Well, it's funny too because you had said earlier on, like, like when we were talking about the nature of its as a piece of art that is trying to force you to look at it. You had said specifically you're not sure if you would even consider that art, and yet here we are saying that the game absolutely did force a conversation. So, you know, take that for what it is, I guess. The one thing I'll throw out there is that we've referenced the Save Your Game podcast a couple of times. That episode's going to be in the show notes, and I want to highly recommend it. There are things that we discussed in this podcast that they did not, like the art curator, for example. But there are also a lot of things that we did not get to here. So if there's other things that you're very curious about with it, and also just if you like point and click adventure games to begin with, Save Your Game's a great podcast. Pushing Up Roses and Matt are both great hosts. So check out that podcast if whether you do the Harvester episode or not. Check out the podcast in general. But if you want to learn a little bit more about Harvester, hear some things that about the game that me and Mont were able to get to. Highly recommend that. You can also watch the Game Grumps play it. I do find that to be a very amusing playthrough, especially if you're a fan of anything like MST3K. I think if there are favorite Game Grumps episodes of mine, it's the ones that are kind of feel like they're just kind of riffing on the game, and they do end up having a kind of good conversation about games and game violence at the end of it because the game's not subtle about what it's about. So maybe give that a look too. Those will both be in the show notes. That's gonna wrap it up for Harvester. Shall we talk about what we're doing next month?
Oh man, Adrian, we should definitely talk about that. So, September is coming, and for September, we are going to be talking about a little known game called Dead Rising.
Yeah, maybe a little bit more better known than Harvester, right? But also, I think one that kind of also plays around with an exploitation movie kind of aesthetic, in the same way that Harvester does, just in a very different way. Uh, I'm not gonna lie, another one of my favorite games of all time, so I'm very, very excited to talk about it. Very curious about this remaster slash remake that is also coming out in September. I was honestly planning on us doing Dead Rising probably sometime next year, and then they dropped this on us. So yeah, Dead Rising is next month. Please look forward to it. Until then, though, I'm Adrian,
And I'm Lamont.
and you've been listening to Playing Dread. You've been listening to Playing Dread, a Q27 Media Production and a member of the New Jersey Horror Collective, hosted by Lamont Williams and Adrian Sandoval. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends, or just consider leaving us a review and giving us top ranks on your podcast listening service of choice. Check out our show notes at playingdread.libsym.com and consider becoming a Playing Dread patron on Patreon. Social media links including YouTube, Blue Sky, Instagram, and more can be found at www.playingdread.com. All music is under a Creative Commons Attribution license. The intro music is The Curse of the Dolls by Jeff Harvey, and other music in this episode was performed by Alex Grohl, Dimitri Taras, Grand Project, and Pump Up the Mind.